Welcome for a session on F.R. Leavis. Today we'll look at some of his works and the concepts he had introduced. F.R. Leavis is a critic known for his firm standards and moralism, and he's one of the founding editors of a quarterly journal of criticism called Scrutiny, and the other editor was Queenie Dorothy Roth, who later became his wife. His early critical interest was in poetry, and some of his works are New Bearings in English Poetry, a study of the contemporary situation, Reevaluation, that is tradition and development in English poetry, and his later interests shifted towards novels, and some of his works are The Great Tradition of 1948, D.H. Lawrence, Novelists, Anna Karenina, and other essays. His preoccupation with literary criticism is constantly seen throughout his works, and spanning from 1950s to 1970s. Some of the common ones are, or the most famous ones are, The Common Pursuit, Education in the University, Our Literature in Our Time and University, The Living Principle, English as a Discipline of Thought. Leavis is seen as a successor to Matthew Arnold because he also views literary studies as a form of criticism of life he believes can pierce through dominant ideologies, and according to him, the field of literary studies allows the mechanical age of life to redeem itself. F.R. Leavis and his concepts or his theories must be seen in the context of the 20th century, and for F.R. Leavis, 20th century world was purposeless and aimless because World War I had just happened and it had destroyed almost any semblance of the old Victorian consciousness of England. Organized religion has gone into decline, even that is seen even during the Arnold's days, and therefore the religion failed to offer any coherent explanation for the destructions of the war. There was a constant pursuit of pleasure or hedonism in 1920s, and this search is supposed to illustrate the emptiness of modern life, and it is also a period where there was loss of faith in any codes of regulation, especially from religions. So therefore, F.R. Leavis's vision of literary studies must be read as a response to this moment in history. It was an attempt to counter the forces of popular literature and Middlebrough culture. It was also to restore the coherence of contemporary life. Leavis propagated literary studies as a way of understanding the evolution of modern life in all its complexity. The holder of literary degree in 1930s and 20s became most fit for bearing the high offices. In the late 1930s, English became the subject that is the only subject worth studying, and the English as a subject became supremely civilizing pursuit, and it gave the spiritual essence for social formation as understood by F.R. Leavis. Another important note to remember is that Leavis was always wrongly categorized as in the field of practical criticism, which is also a product of 20th century. However, it emphasized on close reading and to discover how a work of literature was self-contained and it functioned as a self-referential aesthetic object. And it was always about the words on the page. However, according to Leavis, the aim of literary scholar is to bring his research to bear on the socio-political issues and the conduct of cultural life. Therefore, he is not, although he looks at some of the aspects of new criticism and practical criticism, he is not by himself a practical critical theorist. And just like Matthew Arnold, F.R. Leavis also believed in touchstones that determine the high seriousness in literary texts. For Matthew Arnold, having a touchstone to compare a text made it possible to alter the consciousness of the Victorians and also set standards of quality. And but for Leavis, the standards are formed in comparison of works by works of the age, and Leavis also reevaluated the standard practice in the course of English literature, where all literature and texts of a century were studied, regardless of all their tendencies. Instead, he argued for a denser canon of works that argued properly with essential social cultural issues that reflected the society of that time. For him, literary figures who were more interested in form than the content, more interested in the beauty of the language rather than the ideological uses of the text or of the content in the text, were less important. For example, one of the critique of F.R. Lewis, Richter, this is a very recent publication, this is 2007, gave an example of how he graded the authors in all his works. The mellifluous Tennyson was not to be preferred to the harsh, difficult Hopkins. The clever referentiality and aestheticism of Joyce ranked far below the prophetic visions and cultural radicalism of D.H. Lawrence. The research medievalism of Spencer and the idiosyncratic religiosity of Milton devalued them beneath Donne and Marvell. We also will see later how D.H. Lawrence was placed in a higher standard or a higher level than James Joyce, who is very celebrated in their time. And some of the works I am using for this presentation by F.R. Lewis is The Great Tradition, and another two other articles from his journal called Scrutiny, which are Literary Mind and Literature and Society. In Great Tradition, he says the great English novelists only are Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James and Joseph Conrad. And in a similar way, in his earlier works, he pronounced that Milton is negligible, and he dismissed the Romantics, and he also held that John Donne, there is no poet we need to really bother about except for Hopkins and T.S. Eliot. He also says in one of his works that the only way to escape misinterpretation is never to commit oneself to any critical judgment. The only way to escape misrepresentation is never to commit oneself to any critical judgment that makes an impact. That is, never to say anything. However, the most profitable discussion takes place only when is as clear as possible with oneself and what he sees and what he wants to judge, or any critique in this sense. And one must establish the essential discriminations in the field of interest. He also says the field of fiction is so large that there are insidious temptations to complacent confusions of judgments and to critical indolence or lethargy in reading through text. Going to the minor novelists in the Victorian age, he says minor novelists of the Victorian age such as Charles Reade or Henry Kingsley, Wilkie Collins, in the 1930s and 20s their works were brought to attention and they were publicized more as broadcasts, suggesting them as living classics of the previous age or from the previous age. But then one must question what names are necessarily should be part of literary history and what names or what works are significant as creative achievement. He goes on to say that the novelist must not only change the possibilities of art for the practitioners and the readers, but they must be significant in terms of human awareness they promote, awareness of the possibilities of life. The most of the focal words of F.R. Lewis revolves around life and experience, and most of his judgments and criticism of the works also fall on the human experience and human intelligence and creativity, which again fall back on experience. In the work The Great Tradition, again he names Jane Austen as one of the greatest writers of the Victorian age because she reflects the society of that time, and he also says something about her learning experience that are seen through her works. And before this we should also see that he says not by naming few brilliant novelists he does not devalue the existence of tradition, but rather provides an understanding of what tradition is. And this is where we see Jane Austen, because she is to have she is one of the early women writers who are very much celebrated, and from her works we see the Victorian age and the livelihood of the Victorian age households, and at the same time her works string in many different threads from that are very common to the Victorian age, which again are pulled out by other writers to develop something better or to develop something more deeper in understanding of human experience. So these are the words of F.R. Leavis about Jane Austen. Jane Austen is one of the truly great writers and herself a major fact in the background of other great writers. She read all there was to read and took all that was useful to her, which wasn't only lessons. In fact, Jane Austen, in her indebtedness to others, provides an exceptionally illuminating study of the nature of originality, and she exemplifies beautifully the relations of the individual talent in the tradition. If the influences bearing on her hadn't compromised something fairly to be called tradition, she could not have found herself and her true direction. But her relation to tradition is a creative one. She not only makes it tradition for those coming after, but her achievement has for us a retroactive effect. As we look beyond her, we see what went on before, and because of her, we see the potentialities and significances which are brought out in such a way that for us, she creates the tradition we see leading down to her. Her work, like the work of all creative writers, gives a meaning to the past. He takes an example of one of Jane Austen's work, Emma. He continues to comment on it. He says, as a matter of fact, when we examine the formal perfection of Emma, we find that it can be appreciated only in terms of moral preoccupations that characterize the novelist's peculiar interest in life. Those who suppose it to be an aesthetic matter, a beauty of composition that is combined miraculously with the truth to life, can give no adequate reason for the view that Emma is a great novel, and no intelligent account of its perfection of form. It is in the same way true to other great English novelists. So he says that when you look at a work as a creative piece and just as an aesthetic object, you will not be able to see the higher purpose of the text or what the work is trying to reflect. And that is what he says must be a change in the literary critical field, where the works are judged for what their content says, what they are trying to illuminate. But he does not refute the existence of English tradition. So he says, but there is English tradition, and these great classics of English fiction belong to it. However, he also goes back to say that all the minor writers of Victorian age will not be part of the English novel as a category that puts them all together. He says not everything can be categorized as the canon. He says a tradition, the English tradition, talks about creating characters and creating worlds, and in this tradition there is no appreciation, or the appreciation goes for Thackeray or Virginia Woolf or Trollope will always disappear, because their work does not reflect the tradition in the content. Out of the four, the second one is George Eliot. He finds as a great English novelist, and he says George Eliot also learns from Jane Austen, and therefore there is a continuity from Jane Austen, and therefore she is part of the tradition. He also says George Eliot admired her work, and George Eliot as a writer whose intellectual weight and moral earnestness strike some critics as her handicap, whose genius and problems are necessarily very different, is the hardest kind of influence to define, even when we see it to have been of the profoundest importance. Here F.R. Leavis tried to say that although they all belong to different eras, what George Eliot learned is the way Jane Austen weaves the irony, the way Jane Austen weaves the life and the experience in her writing, which does not throw it on the reader's face but is subtly present And this subtlety is what George Eliot takes in with her, and she adds it to the spirit of her works, which is lot of vigor of the country life, and altogether a different setting that George Eliot talks of in some of her works. And yes, and after so for Lewis, after Joseph Conrad, the only other great novelist that can reach up to their standard is D.H. Lawrence. Says this about his works and D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence in the English language was the great genius of his contemporary times. I mean the age or the climatic phase following Conrad's. In his novel, he committed himself to the hardest and the most sustained labor, and he was as a novelist the representative of vital and significant development. He might, if his genius had let him, have gone on writing novels with the kind of character creation and the psychology that the conventional cultivated reader immediately appreciates. Novels that demanded no unfamiliar effort of approach. However, his genius manifests after the great success of his work Sons and Lovers, as he gave up that mode of writing and devoted himself to exhausting toil of working out the new things and new developments that, as the highly conscious and intelligent servant of life, he sought to be necessary. He goes on to say that Lawrence was a most daring and radical innovator in form and method and technique, and his innovations and experiments are dictated by the most serious and urgent kind of interest in life. This spirit, by virtue of which he can truly say that what he writes must be written from the depth of his religious experience, that makes him so much more significant in relation to the past and the future. Lawrence believed that one must speak for life and growth amid all the mass destruction and disintegration. It is the spirit of originality that gives his novels the disconcerting quality and also gives them the significance as a work of genius. Here, Lewis places the writing of D.H. Lawrence within the context of Lewis's own times, which is also the rise of modernist times, and there is no center in the times of 1920s and 30s. As a contextual understanding of the 19th and 20s, where religion had declined and he needed that faith and the belief in something to prop up. And this was also the time where there was no center, there was no faith, there was no structure, and this seemed like he was going back to the past to hold on to tradition as the only thread that would connect the past and the future and show a direction for the authors and for the readers and the general public who will be influenced by the reading of these texts. We also see in Lewis, he constantly proposes that literary studies and English literature must be part of every man's education, just so that they understand the beauty of human experience and life. Going back to Lewis's other works, most of his career is characterized by a lot of boldness in his opinions and the originality in all of his opinions. And in one of his readings on how to teach reading in 1932, Lewis had pointed out that the criticism of the novel was in its infancy, filled with shallow notions of characters, and who had a real life extending beyond the text, and who also created a world among themselves within the text. And in a series of articles in the journal Scrutiny, he used the term dramatic poem to indicate a formal and structural approach to the novel. He is one of the pioneers of narratology, but was never content to remain within the bounds of narratology. Characteristically, he also insisted that prose should be read like verse, with the required attention to close details while insisting that the isolated passage could not do justice to the whole. And this again is one of the aspects we see going back to the practical criticism, where although where the work or the or the sentences or the words on the page are weaved together in coherence. And this is where he develops that from. Going back to the idea of tradition, he says even in his work The Great Tradition, that he never implies that no book, that the other books that he is not appreciating is not worth reading. He says they might touch upon the ideas of tradition, they might touch upon the aspects of tradition, but they cannot be part of the canon. And if every work is being included in the canon, the whole values and the values that are and the morals that are introduced by the canonical works will be diluted. Welleck, in review of Lewis's work Re-evaluation, Welleck suggested or claimed that he wanted a norm to which an author could bring up a work, and due to the reply Lewis gives, he is seen to be the opponent of philosophy and theory in favor of untheorized practice, because he also falls back on value system alone and a reflection of society. Lewis expresses in his reply a concept of complete reader, realizing the complex experience of literature as opposed to the abstract philosophical formulation. Lewis argues not by the application of an external norm and hence are not immutable. Lewis refuses to formulate criteria. He says the next work might be different. Inevitably, the individual critique forms a structure based on more constant preference. The structure is open to further modification by a new work which could require a different response on other grounds of judgment, and hence certain state any kind of norms that would provide or that would be a tool for a critique to judge the works. This is exactly why, even though he talks a lot about the tradition, he never absolutely defines what that tradition means, and he only tries to explain the tradition through the works of Jane Austen, George Eliot, or Conrad, or for that matter Lawrence. According to Lewis, critical judgment has the form, "This is so, isn't it?" and the newness here modifies the sense of value, creates another sense of value by which it is to be judged. Lewis's criticism rejects the critical wisdom of any age that provides absolutes for the future. Judgment is not a matter of abstraction. What one needs is a real and appropriate responsiveness to the thing offered, and a free and delicate receptivity to fresh experience. Declared values become empty husks, things formerly validated by experience, once fixed, become natural and automatic, and therefore ceases to have life. And here Lewis emphasizes that the life he means is the development that happens, is the decline or the improvement that a tool or a theory could have. Although he never uses the word theory, he never proposes it as a theory. Another journal that existed in the times of Lewis is called the Criterion, and that journal had a political stance or a narrative through which it critiqued the other works. However, Criterion as opposed to Scrutiny. He also said while Criterion judges the works with the specified political criteria, Scrutiny journal will only scrutinizes the work. It will judge them as the reader or the critic reads the text, and therefore it is to an extent an individual experience of the reading of the text itself. His issue with the Criterion journal is that judgment is too easily the applying of accepted standards. Thought is too easily the moving of recognized abstractions according to rule. Lewis does not propose that the judgments of literary criticism do not hold any extra literary choices or decisions, and he does not propose that any aesthetic concern of the literary work is only a thing of beauty. However, the relationship to the life that the text holds is all the more important to him, and this is where he connects with the critique of Marxism and where he refutes with the Marxist critiques. He says any judgment of literary value must involve extra literary choices, which again he also includes religion and spiritualism and morality, which the criterion he believes always leaves out. In his work Restatement for Critiques, he declares himself not politically indifferent. He says no hope is to be based on bloody revolution. However, he also says some form of economic communism is inevitable and is sometimes very desirable. Here he draws lines on where the communism as an understanding must end. He also says civilization needs to be saved by an intelligent working towards this end, where here this end denotes the education, denotes a non-violent way of going forward to the future, where and not an instigation of revolution which is violent and which is destructive. He also says the question that always remain is communism of what kind. In this regard, Lewis wishes to foster through education an anti-acquisitive, anti-competitive moral bent, where he says it should not be this or that, this political ideology over another. He believes in non-unhegemonic working of criticisms. He also insists on senses of complexities in all the texts, and he wants to cherish the senses, cherish the sense of complexities, knowing well that to Marxists this is to play the bourgeoisie game. He, while criticizing the Marxist criticism in Marxism itself, he criticizes the language that are established, and he calls them dead language because there are certain phrases that are repetitively used, such as bourgeoisie and class struggle. Lewis goes back to the commentary that Marxism is the alcohol of the intellectual, warming and exalting, obliterating difficulties and incapacitating for elementary discrimination, so much so for the opium of the masses. He says Marxist is furthermore too bourgeois in being, like the bourgeois themselves, too much the product of material environment, being the creature of the processes, in the same way a capitalist on the possibilities of the progress. The Marxist future is vacuous, and they have with too little thought about the nature of culture that exists through the time. And this, the critics of Lewis also argue that his partial, he is leaned towards Marxism in some partial sense, in some aspects. However, he sharply criticizes any other, in a very typical Lewis attempt, in any competing establishments of orthodoxies, such like, and in concepts of hegemonies and discourses, and he believes that those any kind of competing establishments will not allow for a balanced view of what a text says. He keeps questioning if there is a human nature, or if there is such a thing as human nature, and he also questions what are the systems or discourses that determine an individual who reads the text or even writes the text. He also questions if he also goes back on the question of is the author dead. In another work of Lewis called Literature and Society, he defends himself from the accusations that his criticisms are isolated, individual and purely literary in value that are proposed by Romanticism. However, he also goes back, specific creative gifts of any individual will not create a masterpiece, and that comes with the learnings from the tradition, that comes from its relation to the culture, and it comes from its reflection of life and the experiences. He asserts that there are set of determinants other than the material and economic, which are enormous. But the shaping of tradition for critique and the writer can be literary as well as material. Here is where he brings in Marxism again, where he talks about the shaping of one's writing, shaping of one's work, and the shaping of the material or the content he uses. Here, material considerations in another sense is the socio-economic structures that exist, and the propagation of a certain desire for another or a different kind of socio-economic structures that exist in the times where the text is being published. There are various shaping systems. He then asserts that there is nevertheless a measure of spiritual autonomy, human intelligence, choice and will. These matter with an inherent human nature. Without the individual talent, there is no creation, only predestined automatism, which is not Lewis's own time, but this is that of the critiques. Only in individual does a society live, and only in individual a culture passes through, and therefore every individual creation, every individual work matters even as part of tradition, because otherwise the tradition will not be taken forward and there would be the abrupt end or decline to that certain tradition or that certain practice. In dealing with the products of human creativity, the sphere of critique is to perceive the subtleties and complexities rather than to enforce the domination of ideas and criteria. This is where he goes back to saying that any set ideas will only curb the understanding of the text in its full-fledged form, and it will not allow the creativity of the reader to flow, and that would hinder the process of learning about life and learning in general. Lewis also criticizes Marxism that by saying that there is a certain autonomy of the human intellectual, and aesthetic and moral activity expresses not only the class origin and economic circumstances, and therefore using class structure and class oppression as only lens of looking into literature will not only hinder the process of understanding the cultural differences but also the differences in the experiences of different authors and the characters in the book. However, he also says some of the books that were Victorian, that spoke about the Victorian era in the 1920s, were not being received well for the fact that bourgeoisie was being criticized during that time and it was in the decline, and not for any other reason. However, he says that literature and criticism were always related to society, and he said he always wanted to preserve a certain autonomy of the human spirit, and this is exactly where we see again D.H. Lawrence and George Eliot being appreciated by Lewis, where he says the vigor of their work, the spirit of life in their works is one of the things that makes them great novelists, that are their novels and works reflect the spirit of living. He also says systems are not absolute and systems modify, and therefore a significant new work can change the whole structure and one's previous perceptions of the cultural structure and also the work. And this is where he again criticizes Marxism for saying that they provide class structure and oppression as the only lens through which the texts are read or dealt with. But the times change, just like how the Victorian era changed, the ideas of Victorian era changed, so will the ideas of the 20th century. Although in this time James Joyce's work came out as one of the most celebrated work, he believes that James Joyce's work is very unstructured and there is no center in that text, and it does not celebrate any form or it does not celebrate any moral value, and therefore it should not be well celebrated as that of D.H. Lawrence's. And for Lewis, criticism is a collaborative creative process, and it is the creative writer for him who exemplifies freedom, while literature is the most significant mode of language. And therefore, by considering criticism as a collaborative creative process, it allows the readers full possession of the text. And this is how he goes back to the question of, is author dead? But here he does not pose that on the author, but on the critic, who makes available a framework to understand the text as he as a reader understood, and it must be understood in the cultural context, but a critique should never suggest that this is the only way it can be read. Yes, of course, Lewis's criticism is not devoid of theory, because he deals with most of the critical preoccupations that were later theorized, and he also showed how relative freedom is indeed a possibility, while the reader's freedom to understand how a text can be understood, and while also challenging that no dogma can remain permanent. And this is throughout these are things that are understood throughout the 30 years of articles that he published in the journal Scrutiny. He always negotiated between the society, tradition and individual talent, and he negotiated between the text and the literature, and also what has been already given in the past and what is the perspective of the new future. Lewis's understandings went into a decline after his death, and after some of his followers started a field of studies called Lewis studies, posed these questions on what is the purpose of reading Lewis in these changed and still changing circumstances, and how can the work of Lewis serve today as an intellectual tool for understanding and possibly changing higher education. These questions fall on two basic factors. One is that Lewis's socio-educational thought closely embedded in critiques of specific literary texts. So the understanding is that if you take away readers' familiarity with these texts, Lewis's arguments will seem to fall or will seem to not hold. And also Lewis's negative verdict on mass culture, and in another work he had opposed the idea of democratic mass university. However, the question of what is the purpose of reading Lewis in the changing times, and how as an intellectual he serves for the understanding of higher education, comes from some of his works where he very much emphasizes on the idea of creativity, which he places on the idea of learning and higher education and university. And the answers for those questions depend on three different premises. One of the premises is that Lewis is a rich source of ideas, and his experiences and his understanding of experiences that dealt with the society and higher education. So it means that while he dismissed the mass culture, the depth and the seriousness with which Lewis poses questions about culture and society and education, and his conception of language, are always a considerable force in understanding the text.